There are some people who say that most people are kind, loving, well-intentioned, honest, and law-abiding citizens, and that we're thus basically all one big happy family. But if so, does that really add up? Now, some might say, for instance, that yes, we all care about others, generally speaking, except for a few quote-unquote oddball, whacked-out, psychopathic mass murderers, so to speak. But is that actually the case, that there are just a few so-called bad apples? Now, some others would say, yes, we are all basically decent human beings except for a few bad apples, but then there's this element called competition, especially for what some would call scarce resources. Others might state that certain scarce resources have been engineered, especially legally, that these are what you might call artificial in nature, and that there's generally, otherwise speaking, enough to go around. Or that certain shortages, you might say, or stress points are generated by what some call your rights being taken away, or the rights of some people. Or you might say certain legal constraints put upon us, and not upon some others. And others having some advantages that some others don't have, in terms of freedoms for certain activities, or comfort level, or feelings of safety overall. But again, does this always hold water? I think this can get even all the more complicated when we run into people who not only state that they are part of a so-called majority who are kind, loving, empathetic people, and honest and law-abiding and so on, but have taken the step next of entering a career field which is called a caring profession. And they are thus deemed out of the box upon obtaining a certificate, as I would call it, 4 years in length as per attending an institution, or 8 or 12 years of length, pronounced caring and professional. But is this always the case? Even if the intent is there to be caring? Even if we ruled out this instance of talk about there being certain key resources we claim we need that are in short supply, and thus there's great competition for these, and some people suffering down the line, getting the short end of the stick, so to speak, in the competitive process, is this all there is to it also? I would bring up 2 key points. These crossed my mind for years now and have achieved more and more clarity of thought and the words to go with it, I believe. First, let's take the case of someone who is generally what you call caring or what you call empathetic. I would state this often comes from their having suffered tremendously in childhood, themselves personally, or having witnessed it in a family member or a community member, or having done volunteer work in general, and seeing a specific aspect of society impacting a person negatively. And they thus want to make a career or volunteer work activity out of helping individuals, and thus branded at a certain point in time as being a helping person and moreover helping professional if they have these certain credentials. But again, even if we leave out the concept of there being sometimes certain key elements of living life that are in short supply, or most would say so, and this impacting how they treat others then, in terms of a variety of factors, including overall honesty, what about this aspect that I bring up right now? Just because someone wants to help genuinely, and maybe has the skills to do so, does not mean they don't have what I would call addictions that take priority. And this is no small matter, I believe, what I bring up now. In other words, you could be the most, quote, loving, caring, and skillful person in the whole planet, on the whole planet. And yet, if you have a heroin addiction or cocaine addiction, that takes priority. In other words, getting your fix takes priority. And we all know this when it comes to chemical-based addictions. But how many of us think of other addictions as per an addictive process or addiction, basically, if it is not chemical in nature, or not one of the few others discussed commonly, like gambling or a sex addiction? For I would maintain, after having read the book When Society Becomes an Addict by Dr. Ann Schaaf and some other books, that we have a whole group of addictions that are not chemical in nature, and also not your typical, what you call gambling addiction or sex addiction, say, or food addiction. I'm not going to go into these right now, but amongst the things brought up by Ann Schaaf, Dr. Ann Schaaf, is that many Americans have a work addiction, paralleled only more in problem nature by Japan. Many of us also have what you would call relationship addictions. These are not very well defined and explained and talked about addictions. But I do like the coverage in about a 5-minute video by Elaine Day Botton, Dr. Elaine Day Botton in England, who has videos on YouTube and a school he runs there called the School of Life. And he details how certain addictions are talked of very openly, and I would say almost scapegoated. Perhaps he says the same thing. The standard ones, sometimes to the delight, you might also say, or comfort level in general, of those with other non-chemical based or traditionally called addictive issues. But still quite problematic, if not in the short term, the long term. And so, this is my point here, that even if we were to say, to recap, that everybody almost, with a few exceptions, is kind and loving and empathetic and so on, these types of words, and are to be, quote, trusted. Well, I would state, if that were true, there surely are a number of factors that could intervene to make how we are treated less than ideal by far. Let's just put it that way. And thus, even to the extent that we would call them not our buddies or our friends, but red flags and more. Why? Again, because of what I would call addictions, often not even chemical in nature, and often flying under the radar because they are so commonplace that we may have these same ones ourselves, be implanted in it, embedded in it, like in a matrix, and be totally unaware, especially with the media and other factors at play, and not know they are addictions. And these then impacting the so-called helpers, even at the, quote, trained level. Or again, in my mind, an addiction is a defense mechanism process that requires the performing of the defense mechanism from time to time, or what some euphemistically call getting your fix. In my mind, to get your fix is to exercise that defense mechanism from time to time, at generally a downside to yourself, some aspects more than others, just like a pharmaceutical prescription drug, or illegal substance drug also, if you wanted to call it that. Everything having a plus and minus point. Another factor, and I will say the last factor, and not a small one in my mind, having seen this play out quite a bit by the time now in my life at age 62, is that a defense mechanism or drug of choice or fix that you can get, so to speak, can also involve loving to see others suffer at your hand, if not just witnessing it. And in other words, This can happen just as much, if not more sometimes, I believe, in a so-called helping person / helping professional. That the fix then that they wish to desire amongst others of a non-chemical nature can sometimes be the desire to see others suffer, especially if they suffered greatly in childhood from some kind of trauma or what you might want to call it, and it has not been adequately resolved. If they can't, quote, get revenge on what caused the trauma, typically a family member, then they will want to get revenge somewhere else or discharge that anger somewhere else, surely. It's called displacement, or when you come home from a frustrating day at work, you, quote, kick the dog, or someone else in the family, physically speaking or verbally. Sam Vaknin talks of this in videos, by the way, and as per one of his books on narcissism, in a very short paragraph somewhere in the middle of the book on the displacement defense mechanism. And so my second and basic point, and not a small one, I believe, is that certain practitioners in, quote, helping professions have amongst the panoply or spread of defense mechanisms or fixes that they wish to get from time to time, or non-chemical drugs of choice, the desire to see others suffer in some manner, because they have their own pain points that they couldn't get resolved. A little humorously, if not, having watched the movie Come Sunday, talking about Carlton Pearson, a bishop in the church, it had stated in the movie and shown, whether fictitiously or not, I don't know, that another individual in the church so wished hellfire damnation to exist because otherwise his father would not be burning in hell forever as punishment for how the father treated that son, the bishop or minister, and I'm not talking about Carlton Pearson, but another person. In other words, even a, quote, helping professional called a minister of a church in this case, fictitious or not in the movie Come Sunday, desired to see someone else suffer, as per, shall we say, the Bible verse, vengeance is mine, saith the Lord. That is, if you can't take matters into your own hand and exact your own retaliation and get away with it in every way, shape, and form. I see this playing out in so many ways then. Why would a so-called helping person, even vetted by degrees, not have the same issue at hand oftentimes, if not more? For, in fact, many say that a number, if not most, of people who go into certain therapy disciplines at a traditional approach are there to heal themselves, and it is questionable the degree to which they have done so. In fact, who has ever gone to therapy and required that the therapist provide the purchaser of the services or client a blood test certifying that the practitioner takes no psychiatric drugs, as well as credentialing as to what therapy they went through, and a panoply of sources stating that it was quite effective also. Who also requires of their therapist that they document that they have a healthy sex life or that their children are also healthy in every way, shape, and form. There is, in fact, a notorious phrase for many ministers' children, preachers' kids. And yet, what minister touts that they have quote-unquote very healthy children if asked, and provide proof, videos and so on, and school records to boot. Hence, my contention overall is that maybe it's possible that most people are wonderful, loving people, and we're all big, one happy family except for certain elements that are in high demand that you have to compete for. Or secondly, that perhaps we might say that some people have chemical addictions that get in the way of practicing their desire to help other people. But my contention is that there can be another factor, often going under the radar, that there can be defense mechanisms or getting your fixes that are non-chemical in nature and common as dirt, so to speak. And these fly under the radar as oftentimes to be praised in virtues instead of getting a fix for some crutch or defense mechanism or chemical equivalent of an addictive process. And thus, one of the biggest ones to consider that many don't, I think, is that there can even be a drug of choice or fix to be sought from time to time of seeing some people suffer, even at your own hand, if it can be done, some might say, or do. And that can even include those who are providing help as supposed trained professionals as, quote, helpers, including therapists, and some other individuals too, I would have to say. Thus, the desire to help does not come, of course, unadulterated, oftentimes with a desire to see some others suffer. Not all people suffer. One's non-allies suffer the most. One's lucrative sources of income suffer the most, if not providing that income. Those who do not provide key information, those who do not provide key sources of safety buttressing, shall we say. Those become the people who we might sometimes desire not to be so happy and actively take a hand in making that happen, with the proviso, of course, that our brain is structured, I believe, such that the right hand often doesn't know what the left is doing. And that's my final point. The right hand can be trying to help, while the left hand can be trying to tear down, to receive pleasure in seeing someone else suffer, while this right hand, so to speak, is saying, I love to help people. These are my thoughts then.